Hello, everybody, and welcome to Virtual TrekCon 2. Today, we have with us distinguished guest, Professor Lawrence Krauss, author of, amongst other books, The Physics of Star Trek. Why don't you, everybody, welcome Lawrence, and go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, it's good to be with you. It's nice to be here at this virtual convention, which I haven't done many real conventions. As I was telling you earlier, the first Star Trek cruise, which was a new experience for me. But the physics of Star Trek it was written now 25 years ago, and it was it was really designed to it was really terrifying to write, actually, to tell you the truth. Because after I agreed to do it, I realized I could alienate 30 million fans in the States, and I had to figure out a way to write it where I'd be honest to the science. And I decided a book that said, this won't work, this won't work, this won't work, wouldn't be a very fun book. So where things didn't work, I mean, I think it's important when something's impossible to say it's impossible. I'm not going to bend the truth. I have certain rules. But when something in Star Trek didn't work, I thought it'd be fun to relate it to something in the real universe that was close, and sometimes even more interesting. So as a hook to learn to really get people to think about physics. Mainly, I think maybe when I was talking to my editor, the realization occurred that when you're at a party and you tell people you're a physicist, they say, "Oh, how about those Yankees?" or whatever. But when you start talking about time travel, or warp drive, or things that are part of Star Trek, which are physics, but people don't really think of it that way, it breaks, so it goes over that kind of barrier, that fear and intimidation. And anyway, it's been a lot of fun, and I guess that's all I'll say. Yeah, that's all I'll say for the moment.
Well, I've read the book and I thoroughly enjoyed it. As someone who has been interested in science since I was a kid, and also interested in science fiction and everything like that, it's great to see. Like you said, it's more than just oh, you can't hear spaceships in space. There's like so much more to it, and it's. I mean, honestly, I feel like it's a great sort of like a primer introduction into sort of physics and theoretical physics and astrophysics for somebody who maybe only has a cursory knowledge of stuff. It kind of it makes it so accessible because it
Well,
is through that lens of Star Trek.
well, thank you. I mean, that was my intent. The original conceit of it was to try and use it to seduce people who were interested in Star Trek to learn about physics. But the interesting thing is, it's gone both ways too. I think, and Star Trek is a lot of fun. I spent I'll talk about preparing for that book a little bit. But the other challenge to me, which worked out in the end, was I didn't want to write a book where you had to be a Star Trek aficionado to understand it, nor a book where you had to have a sort of a great literacy, a huge amount of literacy in physics to understand it. So it was important to balance those. I wanted to be able to refer to Star Trek and yet not, leave people out in the cold who didn't know everything.
Right.
And what I think for me, the greatest satisfaction was seeing. It was the very first book, and I've written now 11 books, but about science and things. But it was the first book where 8 or 9 year old kids would contact me, and I thought that was the best part because for reaching kids is great. And so the fact that Star Trek had excited them enough about these questions, and that's I watched Star Trek when I was a kid growing up, but I watched it, as I've often said, there's a chicken and egg thing. I watched it because I watched all TV when I was a kid. And so I was interested in it, but did it interest me in science, or was my interest in science what got me interested in Star Trek? I don't know. But I just watched it a lot. But having said I watched it a lot, one of the biggest challenges when I first wrote it is I hadn't watched a lot of The Next Generation, which had occurred later in my life when I wasn't really watching TV. And so one of the tasks, and this was your young listeners or viewers or whatever won't understand a world where you can't go online and get everything you want right away. But at that time, it was impossible, and I had to get access to all the Star Trek episodes, all the Next Generation episodes. And that's when I discovered that if you go down the street and ask people at random if they have, at that time, a videotape of every Star Trek episode, you don't have to go very far before you find someone who has one. And I was able, and so for about 5 months, I watched every episode between midnight and 5 in the morning. I remember when it was back when I taught at Yale. Anyway, that was an interesting experience too.
Yeah, that sounds like I think what all of us are doing right now in the quarantine is like staying up late watching, binge watching episodes of old Star Trek or anything that's going
Yeah,
on.
sure, exactly.
Um, so I was going to ask you about Star Trek influencing you. Were you then as a child you watched Star Trek? Other science fiction you liked to watch, or
Well, I like to read science fiction. I read a lot when I was a kid, and so I like to read science. I mean, I read broadly. It wasn't just science fiction, but I did like um, to read a variety of science fiction when I was a kid. John Wyndham, who's a British science fiction writer, is one that I happen to like a lot, but he's not as well known as many.
Mhm.
Um, and sure, I watched any science fiction that occurred, and probably watched it less critically than I may now watch it. Um,
yeah,
no, although I actually have no problem suspending disbelief. After the book came out, I did a lot of TV shows with some very well-known science fiction writers, and one of the things that was clear um, is that what makes good science fiction is not the science; it's the story. And if
Mhm.
it's not a good story, then it doesn't really matter. The science is there to uh, um, uh, to enhance things, and sometimes allow you a simple out when there's a problem. Technobabble on Star Trek, but but the science is secondary. I think it's a good story, and if it's a good story, people like me I don't mind suspending disbelief for a good story. It's just when the things are so ridiculous that you can't help but think about it, that the story gets ruined, like Starship Troopers or something, which was so stupid.
which,
Anyway,
which is which is a great and fun film. I enjoy Starship Troopers, but yeah, it's you
or
get yeah, you get films like that, and then sometimes the the science part can almost take you out of that. This is
Well,
almost like
or the lack of science, but the ridiculous science part can just it takes you out of being into the story. Suddenly, something so jarring is said that you say, "Oh, I can't get into it." And there was another one about a black hole recent, whatever that famous one was with Matthew McConaughey or whatever,
Interstellar.
yeah, Interstellar, which was actually the original story was written by basically determined by a friend of mine, Kip Thorne, is a physicist. But the movie, again, I may turn people off, but it was one of the stupidest movies I've ever seen.
Yeah, I had a really hard time with it myself. I mean, I think he's a fantastic filmmaker, and like
Yeah, I agree.
as far as the execution of the film, it was amazing.
Well,
It looked awesome, and
one
you
of the things that he used, one of the only sort of good parts, although it was really relevant, and the thing that Kip was involved in was trying to get the image of what a black hole might look like, or what it might from a distance, and to try and get that physics right. But that was such an obscure part of what was otherwise a story that was silly. And I think I remember my tweeting two of my favorite tweets. I'll alienate people, but I think I said I watched Interstellar last night. 3 hours can seem like 30 years or something like that. Anyway, and then another one was I watched Interstellar last night. Should have stayed home, which is
yeah.
another if you watch the movie. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Well, so on your book, you have a foreword by Stephen Hawking, who's, as any checker knows, is the only person to ever play themselves in an episode of Star Trek.
Which he was
So,
thrilled about.
yeah, you maybe talk a little
Well,
bit about your relationship with him and.
Well, Stephen and I were friends and I knew each other for many years as well as colleagues. And I knew, and we done a lot of things together. And I knew not just about the appearance, but I knew he was quite tickled by being on it. And I asked Stephen to write the forward, and I honestly didn't think he agreed, but I didn't think he'd do it anyway because I knew Stephen. And also, frankly, it wasn't easy for Stephen to write. So I kind of figured if he wrote a forward, it would be a paragraph or two. And literally one day before the book was going to press, which is typical Stephen, I think, we sort of were biting our nails. And he produced this beautiful and amusing and humorous forward that was just, I was so tickled. It was really sweet. And it's really, and as he said, what he said there is really important. Science fiction like Star Trek serves an important perfect purpose, which is expanding the human imagination. And that's what I like about science fiction as well as science. Is that it expands our imagination. And sometimes science fiction will bring you into the science world and get young kids interested in science. I happen to think, again, the real universe is um, far more interesting than the universe of science fiction. It's more the imagination of the universe is far greater than the imagination of science fiction writers. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Even though things are wild on Star Trek and other things, the reality is amazing. And anyway, so I think his Stephen, Stephen was a fan, and certainly anyway, it was great. It was great that he could. The whole point of that I like to think about Star Trek, and having spent time with a bunch of the Star Trek people, both before, during, and after, is to not take it too seriously. And I know that people who enjoyed it, and I told you before that Bill Shatner and I've spent time together, done some things together. We even made a TV show together once, based kind of
really?
on my book. Well, sort of based on the physics of Star Trek. It took 3 years to do it. In the end, it was called how William Shatner changed the world. But anyway, I think having fun with it is the most important thing.
For
Like
sure.
most things.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's see here. You talk about a lot of the you break down like warp drive and time travel and light speed travel and things like that. What do you think is like the biggest biggest physics sin in Star Trek?
Oh, now you're going to really get me to alienate people.
I have an idea of something you might
the
say.
funny thing is, you reminded me. I put 10 bloopers at the end of the book. Because I just sort of 10 fun bloopers. And when I asked a friend of mine who's a Nobel Prize winner, Steven Weinberg, what the biggest Star Trek blooper was, he said a split infinitive, to boldly go. I think he avoided the question that way. I think they're obvious ones, but I think for me the biggest sin, and I was just actually writing about this in a different context, so maybe that's why it's on my mind, is the fact it gives people the illusion that these deep technical problems can all be solved in an hour. That that these deep science problems, you go away, you have an engineer, you have a good, and boom, and it's done. And in the real world, it doesn't work that way. And the scientists don't have all the answers, and things are done tentatively and with baby steps. But I think it's prepared people for this illusion that, even like as I was talking about this, they're doing that in the pandemic, that somehow science can snap its fingers and solve the problem. And it's a hard problem, and hard problems take a long time to solve. So in some sense, I think the biggest sin is of course you have to do it. You have an hour episode. I mean, you can't have any choice. But I think it gives people the sense that technology is kind of this magic bullet, which it isn't all the time.
Yeah, or that some of these things can just be done without doing sort of the requisite experiments to make sure they work or whatever. It's like, oh, we're just gonna invert the polarity of the thing and then the thing, and then all of a sudden.
And most of the time it doesn't work, which is really what's important. And it takes a long time to get things to work and to have ideas and most ideas are wrong. Most physics theories are wrong, and that's why it takes time, and that's why it's not anyone can do it. So I guess I'll sidestep your question about the transporter or the warp drive or the the transporter was, by the way, let me just say, it was the thing that got me into the book. I tell people another story, which maybe is useful because it's not from the book. When I first, though I ended up writing that book because I was having a conversation with my editor at the time in New York City. I taught at Yale, so I could take a train down to New York often, and she sort of joked with me about the physics of Star Trek because her daughter was a Trekker. And I joked with her back. I thought it was great. And then I took the train back to New Haven, and I started to think, well, how would I make a transporter? And then I started to think of all the fun physics that you might want to get involved in. And by the time I got back to New Haven, I was hooked.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
Let's see, we had a question here.
Okay. I'm looking at some of the comments, but I don't see many questions.
Oh, here you go. Here's the important question. What kind of chair is Lawrence using? It looks like one of those gaming chairs.
Yeah, no, it's not a gaming chair. I spent a lot of time at my computer, and I tried to find a chair that's comfortable. So I ordered it online, and I can't even tell you the maker. but it probably looks fancier than it is. But it's actually what it really is the captain's chair from an episode of Star Trek. No, I'm just joking.
Yeah, make everybody jealous, right?
I have sat in the captain's chair, but that doesn't matter. I've had a lot of fun experiences because of that book.
Yeah. So I guess the big question then is interstellar travel, is that ever going to be possible, do you think?
With humans, not round trip interstellar travel. I think the distance between stars is too great, and the fundamental limitations on physics are so great that it's kind of ridiculous to imagine that being possible. I think communication might be something, and one-way trips that take a long time. Eventually you might have an arc kind of thing, or humans travel into space because the Earth becomes uninhabitable. But I think the idea of interstellar travel, which again will take a lot longer than on Star Trek, but why would you send humans? I still can't understand that when you could send microchips so much more efficiently, and especially given technology. The big enemy of space travel is weight. One of the things in my book, which I think is kind of early on in the book, which is perhaps surprised and depressed people, is that if you wanted to transport a ship at half the speed of light with conventional rocket fuel, how much fuel would you need? You'd need more fuel than there is mass in the entire visible universe, which, as I said in the book, NASA might appropriate funds for it, but it's not going to happen. But when you have mass, so even if you had matter antimatter, which is the best possible bang for your buck, it would still take many times the mass of the spaceship to accelerate it, using it as fuel on the spaceship, and so weight is the real enemy. So I was actually involved for a little while recently, a few years ago, in a proposal by a Russian billionaire that to investigate the possibility of sending a 1 gram object, 1 square centimeter in a face, to the nearest star at maybe at 20% the speed of light, and whether it might be possible to do it. And it was an interesting possibility. I actually think the more we investigated it, the less practical it seemed to be. I think work is still being done on it. I'm not involved in it anymore. But so humans I don't understand the fascination with sending humans to space, other than the fact, of course, we all want the adventure, we all want that kind of thing. But if you really want to do it efficiently, and if you're worried about living things at the other end, I've always said, you send a chip along with the DNA instructions how to make a human at the other end, and then you make them. So.
Yeah. It's I think there's a bit of the vanity there. It's like going to the moon. Like actually sending a person to the moon is not as important as the other things that we were doing there. Yeah, you could send a probe or like the Mars lander, that sort of.
But it does excite people. I mean, I was a kid. I was 13 when they landed on the moon, or actually older, 14, almost 15 by the time they landed on the moon, and I just stayed home from school every day. Watching, and I wanted to be an astronaut, and so I think it kind of, and I've been with astronauts, and I see the way kids respond, and so it is inspiring. But you're absolutely right. In terms of science, it's the least bang for the buck that NASA does. Not much science is done by humans in space. It's adventure. I have no problems with it. In fact, once I testified before the House Science Committee on space exploration with me and Buzz Aldrin, actually. And I said that. I said, as long as we're honest about we're sending humans for adventure and we're doing non-human probes for science, I don't have any problem with it. It's just that when you take when the human space budget is pretended to be for science and it gets overspent, then you take from the space budget, from the science budget. That's a problem, because we spend so much more money sending humans into space because almost all of the money is spent trying to keep the humans alive. That right. You don't want to infringe on the space budget, at least on the science budget. At least in my opinion, is you shouldn't. And people can have different opinions of it. Some of your followers may have seen me and my friend Neil deGrasse Tyson have spar about it online about the human space exploration.
Yeah, well, I think also there's sort of that like maybe shows like Star Trek have kind of put that that sort of like in people's mind as far as like, well, this is the end goal. The end goal is not just the science for the science sake. You know, the end goal is eventually humans will go to other planets and will spread.
It's exploration. It's adventure and exploration, and that, you know, that's that. You know, I saw someone say they didn't understand what I meant. Why doesn't he mean? Why doesn't we have? Why do we have a fascination sending humans into space? I mean, point is, of course, we have a fascination sending humans into space because we want the adventure. We want to go places. You know, I'd be happy. I think I'd be happy to go to the moon. And I certainly wanted to when I was younger. But what I meant is, in terms of interstellar travel, it's just ridiculous. It's just ludicrous to imagine sending humans on round trips. It's not going to happen. And if you really want to send something from here to a different star, it's not going to be human. That's all. Like it or not.
Yeah. Let's see. So you had so you think time travel, in the same set, time travel probably not a realistic possibility for us to ever achieve?
Well, the nice thing about time travel, and I said it in the book, and I think it's still true, is that we can't prove it's impossible. It's highly unlikely. I think it's, you know, what we know says there are real challenges. First of all, let me put it the other way around. General relativity opens up the possibility of time travel, and special relativity in some sense. First of all, we all do time travel. We travel forward in time, no problem. It's the backward part that's so hard. But general relativity opens up that possibility much greater. Space and time are intimately tied together, and therefore, if in general relativity, they're really the different sides of the same coin, and in special relativity. And so, since you can do a circle in space, I go to New York and back. Why can't I do a circle in time? And in principle, therefore, it should be possible. And in general relativity, what general relativity tells you is that if you have the right kind of energy, if you have the right kind of configuration of energy in space, you could create a time machine. And there are examples of, for example, as I described in the book, a stable wormhole would allow you to create a time machine. The problem is, so mathematically you can write down the conditions that would be configuration that would produce a time machine. The real question is, can you physically reproduce those mathematical conditions? Can you physically produce the kind of energy momentum configuration that would produce a time machine? And there are strong constraints that say probably not. Not definitely not, but probably not. And so, for example, a wormhole, as I think the first person to really argue that a wormhole could be a time machine was, again, my friend Kip Thorne, who later on won a Nobel Prize for discovering gravitational waves. A wormhole could be a time machine, great, a stable wormhole, and there are stable wormholes in Star Trek and other series. The problem is you can show that given the kinds of energy that we know you can create, you couldn't keep a wormhole stable. The mouth of each end of the wormhole would collapse to form a black hole in a time that's shorter than it takes to traverse the wormhole. So there are no traversable wormholes unless you have a new type of energy, and can we create that new type of energy? There are strong constraints from quantum mechanics that say probably not, but no one's proved it yet. So there's that little out. But in fact, Stephen Hawking and I had a debate about it. I forget if we did in the book, but Stephen used to say that time travel was impossible, and the proof of it was that if it were possible, we'd already be inundated by tourists from the future. Mm-hmm. And I countered him by saying they went back to the 1960s and no one noticed. So.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. Do you have a favorite Star Trek episode, or maybe from a personal standpoint, or from a science standpoint, or?
Well, when I was researching the book, there were some things that kind of surprised me, where they'd anticipated physics that I, accidentally, of course. Black holes, for example. I pointed out that the first episode in Star Trek used the word black hole before really it had been used in physics. John Wheeler was the one who coined the term black hole, and they actually got involved in it before he actually coined that term, which I kind of interested. And in fact, there's that one of the earliest episodes, they go too close to a gravitational object, a star, and they get swung back in time, and that's the kind of thing that might happen if it were possible in gravitational physics. So that the fact that they'd accidentally gotten it right kind of amused me. I think my favorite episodes in general, and I don't have many favorites about things. I like things. I don't tend not to list them hierarchically. Probably are the time travel episodes, just because the paradoxes are so interesting, with data or whatever, or going back in time and deciding whether you're going to kill, Hitler, or allow someone to kill Hitler. They're very fascinating to think about. They all have problems, and they all inevitably have contradictions and physics contradictions, but they're fascinating. They were fascinating for me to think about, I think.
Yeah. Where are we? You talked towards the end of your book. You talked about quantum computing, and like you said, the book is over 20 years old. Do you know where we're at right now with quantum computing?
Sure. And I wrote. I mean, the version of the book you're holding is actually a revision I did because there was a new Star Trek series, and I wanted to include that, but because the physics had changed a little bit, and I wanted to include some of the physics. When I first wrote the physics of Star Trek, no one was talking about large extra dimensions as being possible, where aliens might come in and out of. And physics had progressed to the point where actually one of my students had become well known by proposing large extra dimensions. Not that you could jump in and out of, but it was there, so I wanted to include that. But also, the transporter, I remember the first day I got a phone call early in the morning from Europe, and where someone had first coined the term quantum teleportation. And someone said, "You said the transport is impossible, and here's quantum teleportation." And so I wanted to talk about that in that context, because we can indeed do what a transporter sounds like it does, which is sort of, destroy a state here and recreate it here. In this case, instantaneously in physics, but it's not what you're not doing what a transporter does, and moreover, you can only do it because of the very special properties of quantum mechanical systems that are entangled. You can affect the state here and instantaneously affect its partner over there. Although you can never measure what's happened, you don't know if you're over here or over here, that the experiment's been done over there. But it is fascinating. But the point is, we are not carefully prepared quantum mechanical states, you and I. So you can't use that weird aspect of quantum mechanics to allow a transporter. Just like, an electron, I can throw it at a wall, and eventually the quantum mechanics says that it will do what's called tunneling. It'll appear on the other side, and that's fine. But I guarantee you could run into a wall from here to the end of the universe, and you'll never end up on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're not. I read one of the comments was that the so-called quantum teleportation is a misnomer in his opinion. It's a marketing term, and absolutely right. No reporter would have ever called me if the scientist involved hadn't called it quantum teleportation. They were astute, because that got a lot of interest. But quantum teleportation and quantum computing is fascinating. I mean, so we can't use this to send people or bowls of oatmeal or anything else from place to place, but we can use it to, in some sense, manipulate information very carefully in a quantum computer by moving quantum states around the computer to allow many simultaneous calculations to be done at the same time. And that is interesting. And I don't know whether it's ever going to be practical. It's also a very hyped field, one that's extremely hyped. But a lot of progress has been made, and maybe quantum computers that ultimately change the world will be developed. They'll change the world for better or worse. For worse, because unfortunately you'll have to find new algorithms to make your credit card safe, because you can't.
Right.
You'll be able to break codes much more easily. But the good news about quantum teleportation and quantum entanglement is it also allows you quantum mechanically test to see if anyone has been eavesdropping on your communication. So it'll allow new coding techniques with at least you'll be able to look for hackers in another way, and that'll be good. So, but I'm not sure how practical it will be.
Yeah. So as far as they haven't made any real practical strides in.
Well, they made a lot of practical strides, but it hasn't, like many areas that are hyped. It's not yet. I don't know what I'd say. It's not yet ready for prime time, but they haven't. There have been huge strides made in quantum in sort of the physics behind quantum computation and using entanglement and considering encryption, but we don't have yet a quantum computer that's dramatically yet that is going to make classical computers obsolete.
Right. All right, we've got a question from the audience here. What's your take on multiverses?
Well, my take on multiverses is maybe they exist. Kimber, sorry. Well, maybe that's not your real name, but anyway, I the law. I would say that given what we know about physics right now, it's quite likely that there are other universes. Now, I should preface this. When I was growing up, a universe meant something different than it does now. And when I was growing up, a universe was everything by definition. Now we kind of describe the universe as that region of space and time with which we can have causal communication, either of the past or the future. Namely, where the region of space where something can affect something else. And it's quite likely, given something called inflation in the early history of the universe, that different regions of space are created that are forever causally disconnected, in which there may even be different laws of physics. So I'd say that that's probably the preferred picture by physicists right now. Now, the neat thing about that is that you might say, well, that's metaphysics, because we'll never be able to communicate to it, so how do we know they exist? It turns out there are tricky things you can do to look for things called gravitational wave. Kimber, I see that Kimber is your chosen name. Okay, anyway. There are tricky things we can do looking for gravitational waves from the beginning of time, from this period of inflation, that would in some sense give us evidence, not direct, but strong indirect evidence that other universes exist. I wrote a paper on that with a colleague of mine, Frank Wilczek, who won the Nobel Prize, as a matter of fact, and that paper actually won some prize. So that kind of multiverse I find interesting. Now, there's another kind of multiverse which comes from string theory. String theory tends to involve many different dimensions in order to be mathematically sensible. And I think I'm hearing noises, but it's not me. Anyway, string theory requires other dimensions, and therefore, if we're a four-dimensional universe in a 10-dimensional space, there can be a lot of other, four-dimensional universes stacked up. There could be one a millimeter away from us in some extra dimension that we can't measure. And as I say, that's one of the things one of my students was sort of involved in being, in promoting. But we have no evidence that extra dimensions exist, and I find them less well motivated in some sense than the multiverses of inflation. That's a little technical, but it maybe unpacks some things for people.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. So in addition to all the other stuff that you do, that you're part of something called the Origins podcast.
Well, there's two things. I run a foundation called the Origins Project Foundation, which is involved in really trying to bring the most interesting things at the forefront of science and culture to people through public events. We do trips with, we just did a trip to the Mekong Delta with my friend Richard Dawkins, and we do public events, which we're not doing now, but once the pandemic is over, we'll be doing them. I used to do them before at the university, but when I created this foundation, we're doing them separately. But the other aspect of it is the Origins podcast, which has been very exciting because I kind of been able to bring, again, thought leaders in science, in art, in journalism, talking about not only fascinating ideas, but things that are relevant to the greatest challenges of the 21st century. So I have everyone from, Ricky Gervais and Noam Chomsky to Nobel Prize winning physicists, and my friend Alan Stern, whose spacecraft was the spacecraft that at least has gone out among the farthest, not quite the farthest in the solar system, but his New Horizons spacecraft went past Pluto, and we had a lovely conversation about that. But I think science and culture, that's a reason, in fact, probably the first book I wrote that really tried to connect science and culture was The Physics of Star Trek. And since then, I've really tried to continue to do that. And the podcast is kind of continue to do that. My most recent episode was with Stephen Fry, but maybe as a spoiler, I don't think we've let people know this, but we have future episodes with people like Alex Garland, who did Ex Machina and Devs, and two Nobel Prize winning physicists coming up, and as well as some other very well known film directors and other artists. So it's kind of a fun opportunity to give people a chance to do watch an in-depth conversation. And it's not an interview as much as it's a conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think that's great. I think that's one of the reasons why like I enjoyed your book and having you on here is it's a bringing the science and things like that to people. It's not just Star Trek is fun and we all enjoy it, but I think there's something there. You have people who are astronauts today who were inspired because they watch Star Trek, and
Yeah,
people
if
like
you can
yourself.
watch. Sorry to interrupt, but I don't know if you can ever go see that TV show, the How William Shatner Changed the World. It's funny. I actually don't like to watch a lot of TV I'm on, but I enjoy that one because the director was a great young director, and and it's done with kind of a fun, irreverent viewpoint. But you'll see interviews with people who were impacted by and Star Trek when they were younger and influenced their future life.
Yeah, yeah. So as we're talking here, you guys feel free to chime in with other questions that you have, and we'll.
And I see though someone said the UK Stephen Fry, and I said, yeah, the UK Stephen Fry. It's the most
Yeah.
recent episode. Watch it. You can now watch it on YouTube. We can do it on Patreon, which is how you can support it. But after a certain amount of time, you put it on free on YouTube. And so the Stephen Fry episode's up on YouTube. But you still feel free to support the foundation because it's actually more than just a podcast. It's a video podcast. It's made by as you may know, I have been involved in making films as well as, or sometimes being in films, as well as books. And there was a movie that was made about the scientist Richard Dawkins that I called The Unbelievers. And the same filmmakers that made that are the filmmakers who are doing the video for the podcast. And interestingly, for their sake, to promote them, they have a new science fiction movie that just came out called Intersect. But so it's very highly produced video as well, and it costs money to do that, and so it's a non-profit foundation, and so I really do encourage people to support it if you like it.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Awesome.
it's not making people a lot of money.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know it's tough. It's not. It doesn't splash in the headlines as much as some other stuff does. So we had some questions about the mushroom fungus drive. But you told me that you haven't seen Discovery yet. So
Don't tell anyone. You weren't supposed to tell anyone that. No, I haven't really had a chance to watch. I don't watch a lot of TV lately, and I've been tempted, but I don't get the challenge. I don't get the channel that's Discovery's on, and so I haven't seen it yet. I will at some point. I saw the Picard, and because I was able to see it basically, and basically I watch what I can see, and so, but I don't know about the mushroom drive, but it sounds hysterical, and
yeah,
anyway.
yeah. It's I don't even know how to explain it. It's it's the spore drive. It's have to do with fungus that allows them to travel interdimensionally through sort of wormhole kind of things. I mean, it's an interesting show for sure.
Sure. Well, look, I mean, once again, it's no less. The warp drive isn't realistic either, although in some sense it was. Although they're talking about the book, but so fine if it helps them, if it helps push the plot along,
Yeah,
it's fine. It just sounds funnier. I mean, surely they could have called it the mycellular network drive or something like that.
oh, yeah, it does. That is a word that they use, the mycelium
Good.
network, and yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, that's good. Then that's good. The mushroom drive might sound it. Mushrooms can allow you to travel throughout the universe, but not physically.
Yeah, maybe that's the secret that they're going to spoil at the end of the show is that everybody's just
Yeah.
been taking mushrooms, and it was all just like one crazy trip.
Yeah, maybe.
So they ask here, was there a sci-fi franchise that Lawrence thinks is closest to solid physics besides Star Trek? Maybe The Expanse. I don't know if you've seen The Expanse or.
No, I'm trying to think. I mean, I don't label things in terms of how close they are. There was some people used to argue to me that Battlestar Galactica was more realistic. I'm not sure. I think let me see if there's any that I mean, I don't even think. Let me put it this way. Maybe again, people will turn people off from me, which is fine. I grew up at a time when 2001: A Space Odyssey was like this amazing movie, and it was going to be so realistic, okay? And it wasn't. I mean, they didn't violate any laws of physics, but even that totally misjudged the future. Science fiction usually does, because I've often said that science fiction takes imagines a future, sort of based on what we know now. But what physics does is create a new future today. And so science fiction, Star Trek, the 2001, they were going to have hotels in space in 2001 and all this stuff. And in fact, it's a lot more dangerous and expensive to go in space than you might have imagined otherwise. And while people were imagining in the 1950s, hovering, flying cars and everything by this time, very few people ever maybe one or two people obscurely referenced what would have been the internet, which changed our lives more than flying cars or rocket ships or aliens. Although there probably, people claim to be aliens on the internet. And so I think that it's not. I don't think, as I said before, that science fiction should be judged by how close to reality it is, but rather by how compelling the stories are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you had mentioned it in your book too. Is that like what really makes it compelling? Obviously, is the people, it's the interactions, it's the the human
the human drama.
Nature. Yeah, mm-hmm, for sure.
It's like the Greek epics, the famous epics. I mean, they're worth reading. The Odyssey and the Iliad and stuff. And they had their own science fiction at the time. They had the monsters and everything else, but they were great sagas about the human struggle, and I think that's what made them important and lasting. And the early, I think to the extent, I'm not sure, I wouldn't put Star Trek in the same category as the Iliad or the Odyssey perhaps, but it's the same idea, is that if it's lasting, it's because it's captured people's imagination. It's some aspects of the human saga. And I see someone wrote that Tom Cruise is going to film a movie in space. Does that count for a future projection? I've heard about that. We'll wait and see. I think it's dangerous, and he may end up lost in space, which may be a good thing or bad thing for humanity. I'm not sure. But one thing, as someone pointed out to me, is he can meet his 64 billion year old ancestors out in space. Because the craziest thing is, here's a guy who's going in space, but he believes this wacko religion that thinks that somehow he's related to people who are billions or trillions of years old, when the universe is only 13.8 billion years old. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy, isn't it? Anyway, again, I've now alienated all the Tom Cruise fans in the world. Okay.
Yeah. The Scientologists, I live here on Hollywood Boulevard, and there's all the Scientology buildings. I can't walk down to the theater without being handed pamphlets.
Yeah, it's so disgusting, and it's not a real religion. It's if you should read Lawrence. What's his name? The book about Scientology. It's a really great book. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning writer. I've seen dangerous and awful.
Yeah. I've seen some of the exposés on that kind of stuff.
I see you could. I'm looking. You're looking up questions, but I'm happy to read the comments at the same time. So
sure.
Both,
yeah.
I see. There's a question: is there money in asteroids, space mining? The answer, I think, is no. I think again that's hyped up. People say, "Oh, commercial, space exploration will be useful because we'll mine the asteroids and have lots of gold or rare earth elements or something else." And again, I think the business plan for that is overly, to put it mildly, is overly optimistic. It's just damn expensive and hard to go to space. We're right now trying to get 60 grams of material from an asteroid. Colleagues of mine, OSIRIS-REx, are looking at an asteroid and actually landing. They have a lander which will go down, land, put a puff of just a puff of nitrogen, which will kick up some material, and they're hoping to bring that material back to space. And that probably costs $50-100 million to do that. And so, the Earth is a pretty big place, and as difficult as it is to mine under the oceans or anything else, it's probably easier than imagine going into space and trapping an asteroid. So I think these claims about asteroid mining are overhyped, to say the least. Yeah.
It's interesting to think that maybe there's gold in them hills or something, but the cost of getting that.
Well, there is gold. If you want to go out, if you want to somehow go to a different galaxy and mine, and we now have observed the fact that when two neutron stars collapse, we wondered where gold came from. Well, we had an idea, and one of the idea was neutron star collisions, because you don't make it in stars, in normal stars, like you do the other elements up to iron. And And we actually have observed more or less a planet's worth of gold being created in the radioactive decays following neutron star collisions. So you just have to go out there and you can get it. Okay.
Yeah.
Just you have to somehow figure out to go to another galaxy or a far end of our galaxy and anyway, it would cost more than the gold would to do it. I'll tell you that.
Oh, of course. Yeah, you're saying about the stories in science fiction, and to me the last Virtual Trek Con, I did a panel on the ethics of Star Trek, and that was the thing that was always interesting to me with science fiction is moral and ethical dilemmas. And I think one of the big ones that people have always talked about in Star Trek is the transporter. Whether or not it's actually transporting the person or it's destroying the original and making a copy somewhere else. What are the ethical, moral implications of that?
Oh, sure. I talked about that a little bit in the book. And by the way, the ethics of Star Trek, what was interesting about the physics of Star Trek is it created a whole genre of books that were followed it, most by my same publishers. And the ethics of Star Trek was one. There's the biology is all, but happily, I think the physics of Star Trek did the best because it's the most interesting. But the ethics of the transporter is amusing for precise that reason, because basically you're killing someone to recreate them somewhere else. And and as I pointed out, you really can't recreate them exactly, so there's a whole ethical issue. And as I pointed out, if you really believe in the soul, then this would be a great empirical test. If you could have a transporter to see if the new thing that came out had a soul, it would be a great empirical test. It would be, I think I even said in the book, it would be similar to the early days where when people used to argue against in vitro fertilization, the Catholic Church did in particular, because they thought that the embryos so fertilized would not have souls because they weren't created the natural way as God intended. But the minute the first in vitro fertilized embryos were implanted and were born, everyone saw they were people, and that whole issue sort of went out the window.
Yeah, for sure. So number one Trek fan here asks, what would make it less expensive to go into space?
Well, that's a good question, and I think the answer is to not have humans do it. To go into space with small robots, we already do it. I mean, look, I've already said this many times, but you can send a rover to Mars for the cost of making a movie about sending Matt Damon to Mars. Okay, and so we can send objects that are non-humans into space a lot less expensively for many reasons. We don't have to they don't require the same maintenance, and if they don't make it, it's not such a tragedy. But I think small robots are the sort of future of space exploration, and that's the main way to make it less expensive to go in space. Otherwise, it's really laws of physics. Which you can't get around very effectively. I mean, you can make better engineering, and Elon Musk, a friend, and I know he's, I've been in SpaceX and I've seen his rocket engines, which, as he pointed out, aren't rocket science to make. It's pretty basic. You can make those more efficient, and if you do things like recoverable stages, as he does, you can make it somewhat less expensive. But sending people into space will always, I think, be relatively expensive because of this fundamental physics and the fundamental requirements of keeping them alive. It is dangerous and expensive. The simplest way to travel in space is, again, not to travel at all, is to send signals, is to communicate. I mean, what amazes me as a scientist is that we can explore the universe back to the earliest moments of the Big Bang without ever leaving the Earth. And I think that is probably not heralded enough. We've been able to look at almost the earliest galaxies when the first stars were forming the universe, less than a billion years after the universe formed. And we can look at the black hole. The Nobel Prize this year was given for beautiful work on looking at the black hole at the center of our galaxy, which we're never going to travel to. But it's amazing that we can even see or infer its existence by looking at stars moving around that.
Yeah. I guess we'd be remiss if we didn't bring up the topic of contacting alien life on other worlds in any sense. I mean, do you think that's gonna be a possibility for us? I mean,
well, look, that's the other important issue, which I talked about in the physics of Star Trek, and a lot more in the book that followed. I think was called Beyond Star Trek. Before I get there, I can't help but read these comments. It's really amazing to me to read the comments of a new young generation of people. Um,
Sure.
and and I hate to say this, but a lot of your questions about the transporter and brains, and you have to read the book because it's there. I cannot have time to talk about it here. So
Yeah.
I did address those things. But to get to aliens, which is the biggest question, well, look, I think it's, as I say, aliens aren't coming here in spacecraft to do weird, kinky experiments on people, no matter what you may read in the newspapers. It just that the laws of physics say it would take more energy than the power output of a star to take a spacecraft big enough to bring human-sized objects and have them powered by any kind of internal rocket engines. Plus, why would they come here? I mean, how would they know that we've only been sending out signals, even at best, for 50 years of our existence. So anything more than 50 or 70 light years away wouldn't even know we exist. But I do think we have learned, we know that there are 100 billion stars in our galaxy, and 100 billion galaxies or more in the visible universe, and each star, as we now know, probably has planets around it. As an astrophysicist, we kind of expected that in advance, but now we've literally observed stars going around, planets going around distant stars, and discovered that there are more exotic solar systems than we ever imagined. And so most stars have planets around them. And we've learned on Earth that when you have water, organic materials, and sunlight, that life formed on Earth about as early as the laws of physics would have allowed it to form. And so those things are ubiquitous. There's lots of water and organic materials and sunlight in our galaxy. And so I would be amazed if life didn't exist elsewhere. In fact, I suspect it exists elsewhere in our solar system, in the oceans of Europa or Enceladus. But microbial life doesn't make for an interesting science fiction movie, or to some extent it does. It did in War of the Worlds, I guess. Which was a great piece of science fiction writing. But anyway, but so the question you really want to know, and people want to know, is there intelligent life elsewhere? And I think that the answer, I suspect there is, because I suspect life is ubiquitous, and I'd be surprised if we were the only form of intelligence. There are a lot of things that had to happen so we could be here, namely 4.5 billion years of relatively quiescent location at the outer boring suburb of a galaxy, without anything dramatic happening every now and then. An asteroid comes in and causes a huge, extermination of extinction of the dinosaurs and other things. But I think it's likely to exist elsewhere, and as Carl Sagan once said, if it didn't, it'd be an awful waste of space. But let me just finish. The thing is, it's a big universe, and it's going to be really hard to know if it exists. There's another group that's funded by that same Russian billionaire that's doing a better job than SETI or enhancing on SETI to try and listen for signals. But if you think about it, it's like finding a needle in a haystack, and it's going to be a long shot. And I wouldn't be surprised if we don't ever know about the existence of life elsewhere, but that doesn't make me any less sort of optimistic that it does exist.
Yeah, well, and also there's also the matter of time, right? Like, as you alluded in your book, there could have been an advanced civilization a billion years ago that has since died out, and they came up and did everything that they did and sent out their signals or whatever, and then died out even before we even were.
That's right. I mean, it's timing. I mean, if you look at humans, modern humans have been around. Maybe if even liberally talking about what you mean by modern humans, 5 million years or less, and that's an instant in cosmic time. And is there any likelihood we're going to survive another 5 million years? Well, even that is a very short time historically. Plus, we are barely learning. If there were a civilization on Earth that were around 500 million years ago, it's not clear there'd be any evidence of it, even if it was on Earth, just because of global plate tectonics and everything else. So it's a hard business, but it doesn't make me, it doesn't depress me. But it'd be fascinating, of course, and I encourage the search, meaning listening. Unlike my friend Stephen Hawking, who used to say, listening he was in favor of. He wasn't in favor of sending out signals. But that was kind of a moot point, because we're sending out signals whether we want to or not.
Yeah,
with
well,
our radio telescopes and our TV stations and everything else.
yeah, I think he had said something that like, if we ever are visited by aliens, it probably wouldn't turn out so well because they would come here to exploit us or annihilate us or something like
I
that.
said that I said in the physics of Star Trek, whenever two civilizations have met that weren't in contact before, usually in the long term only one survives, but okay, it's not too bad in the end. I mean, it's maybe tragic in one way or another, but I don't think
Yeah.
it's an issue. I really don't think it's an issue. If we contacted, if another civilization somehow, if we were in contact with another civilization, it would likely be more advanced than us, just so because it would be emitting signals we could see or hear. And I think we'd have a lot to learn from them. It would change our culture, maybe for the better. Probably get rid of religion, but maybe not. That was the subject of contact and stuff. It doesn't. No matter what happens, people will still want to believe in fairies in the sky.
Yeah, yeah.
But anyway, so a lot of our culture would change, but anyway, it would they're I think they're out there, and we all want them to be out there, but they're not coming here. Let me just point that out.
Yeah. Is there anything happening right now in the world of science, or whatever, that you're excited about, breakthroughs that are happening or anything like that you're looking forward to?
Every day there are discoveries. I like to say every day I'm surprised if I'm not surprised. I'll return that question into one that Jamal Taylor just asked, which he said, would you be happy or sad if some breakthrough happened that broke the laws that you spent your career on? And I'd be incredibly happy, of course, because being wrong is something that scientists love to be, believe it or not, because it means the universe is more interesting than we thought. Now, I would phrase it differently. When you say that they don't break laws. The scientific revolutions don't do away with everything that went before them. So relativity didn't get rid of Newton, and general relativity didn't get rid of relativity. It just brings it into a new era, and it also allows us to view what we see in a different context. So, whatever we learn about physics in the future, if I take a ball and drop it, it's going to fall, as Newton described it. And whatever I learn about quantum gravity isn't going to change that. So, but if you ask me if there are certain predictions or presumptions I make about the universe that happen to be wrong, certain speculations we make based on what we now know, that's wonderful. In fact, that's what all physicists are looking for. Particle physicists are literally building accelerators to try and find something wrong with the standard model of particle physics because it's too good, and unless we find out where it breaks down, that's where the clues to where the future is, and that's why black holes are so interesting, because maybe the laws of physics break down inside them, and they may be wonderful test cases to help direct us. Physicists are driven by experiments that prove us wrong, and more importantly, if you locked theoretical physicists in a room for 30 years and had them come out and ask them to predict what had been done, they would, their predictions would be totally wrong because the universe keeps surprising us.
Yeah. Well, we only have a few minutes left, so I again want to thank you for joining and direct everybody to check out your book, The Physics of Star Trek, and then your other one is Beyond Star Trek. It's like physics aliens to something.
From alien invasions to the end of time or something. I forget the title for that one, but it's that was a long time ago. The Physics of Star Trek is, as I say, has been redone, and it's that one. And there are lots more science books in the interim. My Universe of Nothing was probably the biggest seller since The Physics of Star Trek, about how the universe can be created from nothing without supernatural shenanigans. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that I have a new book coming out named after the physics of Star Trek. And so you have to know that to realize it's called The Physics of Climate Change. And it was named that way because I wrote The Physics of Star Trek, because as I like to point out, climate science isn't rocket science.
Right. And thank you for writing that book and for keeping up doing what you're doing, and because I think it's it's always important that scientists are doing what they're doing for the research, but then also making the stuff accessible to people who aren't scientists, and keeping that conversation going. And I mean, we all know from what's going on in politics that, especially with climate change, it's like, it's the biggest thing that we have to deal with in our lifetime as a species. And if we don't address that, then
if we don't understand it, and if we have politicians and Supreme Court judges that claim they don't know anything about it, then we're going to be in trouble. So I think it's important. That book was designed not to talk about policy, but just to, like I did in The Physics of Star Trek, to make what may seem daunting physics accessible. and I appreciate that you appreciate it. I think it's important, which is why I do it, and it's what got
Yeah.
me interested in physics, and I'm returning the favor.
Great. Well, so links to Lawrence Krauss's website and the Origins podcast is in the description, and to the next video that's coming up next on Virtual Trek Con. Thanks again, Lawrence, for joining us. It's been a real pleasure, and maybe we can have you back. And
Yeah.
live
Maybe,
long.
and as I said to you, maybe I'll do a real con someday. Okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Would love to see you there.
Okay. You take care. Thanks again. It was fun, and thanks to all the people who listened to watch. Okay. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.